Have you ever stopped to think about everything we don't know about our own history? How many civilizations have risen and vanished without leaving a trace? How many revolutionary ideas were lost before they were even understood? Nietzsche once said, "There are no facts, only interpretations." But what if the interpretation itself is erased from existence? What happens when centuries of accumulated knowledge are destroyed in a matter of days? Human history is not a continuous line of progress. On the contrary, it is a mosaic of fragments, of imperfect memories, of pieces of what we managed to save from time or what we were allowed to save. And the scariest part? A single event, a war, a fire, an act of censorship, is enough to erase centuries of knowledge as if it never existed. Imagine you are holding a book that contains the entire history of humanity. Now imagine that, with each passing century, some pages of that book are ripped out and burned, some are deliberately torn away by those who want to rewrite the facts. Others are lost simply because no one thought they were important enough to preserve. Now I ask you, how can we trust what remains? How can we claim to know our own history if most of it has simply been erased? Nalanda University, one of the greatest centers of knowledge in antiquity, with 9 million manuscripts, was burned to ashes. The Library of Alexandria, possibly the largest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, was destroyed by fire. Countless philosophical, scientific, and historical texts were lost forever, along with ideas that could have changed the world. And these are just the losses we remember. But what about everything that was forgotten before it was even recorded? How can we understand our origins if we only have fragments of our own collective memory? Knowledge is not eternal. It is fragile, perishable, and malleable. Michel Foucault already warned us. Knowledge is not just a reflection of reality, but a product of power. Whoever controls what is remembered controls what is considered true. Whoever holds the records of the past shapes the future. But what if we are living in a new kind of oblivion, not one caused by fire, but by excess? We have never had so much access to information as we do today, yet paradoxically, we have never been so lost. If in the past, history was erased by flames, today it dissolves in an ocean of distractions, manipulations, and noise. What do we truly know about our own history? And what prevents us from becoming just another forgotten chapter in the book of humanity? If tomorrow all history books were burned, who would decide what would be rewritten? The destruction of Nalanda University and the Library of Alexandria were not just intellectual tragedies, but symbolic acts of power. When conquerors and emperors ordered the burning of manuscripts and documents, it was not just an attack on the past. It was control over the future. What survives in history is not necessarily what was most true, but what was allowed to survive. Michel Foucault reminds us that knowledge does not exist outside of power. Every society builds narratives about itself, but those narratives always serve a purpose. Think about the way we learn history. It almost always focuses on the victories of the winners, on kings, on empires. But what about the defeated, those who were silenced? Their records, their truths, their versions of events simply vanished. The destruction of Nalanda is one of the best examples of this. For nearly 800 years, this center of knowledge in India housed scholars from all over Asia, fostering debates in philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. When Bakhtiar Khilji's soldiers set fire to the library, reports say the books burned for 3 straight months. It wasn't just an act of war. It was a deliberate attempt to erase a line of thought that didn't align with the interests of the new regime. But if this has happened so many times in the past, how can we be sure it's not still happening today? Power structures continue to determine which stories are told and which are forgotten. In the 16th century, Spanish missionaries burned almost all Maya codices, wiping out an enormous amount of knowledge about their astronomy, mathematics, and culture. What remained were only 4 manuscripts. 4, the rest was thrown into the fire because it didn't fit the dominant narrative. What does this mean? That the history we know is just a fragment, a version among many possible ones. And worse, a version distorted by what survived through time and power. Plato, in his work, The Republic, warns about the dangers of the noble lie, the idea that those in power can manipulate narratives to maintain social order. What if much of the history we believe we know is exactly that? A carefully edited and filtered construction designed to shape our understanding of ourselves? And now, with the internet and the digital age, a new challenge emerges. If history was once erased by fire, today it can be drowned in excess. We've never had more access to information, but does that mean we're any closer to the truth? Or have we simply become more vulnerable to manipulation? Perhaps the greatest tragedy of human history is not just what was lost, but what was invented to fill those gaps. What happens to a story when there's no one left to tell it? Long before the invention of writing, all of humanity's memory was stored within human brains. There were no scrolls, books, or digital archives, only oral tradition, storytelling, and the recollections of the elders. The problem? Human memory is flawed, selective, and easily manipulated. In his dialogue, Phaedrus, Plato presents a myth in which the Egyptian god Thoth offers writing to the pharaoh as a great gift. But instead of accepting it as progress, the pharaoh rejects it, saying, "This invention will produce forgetfulness in the souls of those who learn it, for they will trust in written characters rather than their own memory." Plato feared that writing would make humanity rely less on living memory and more on static records. But what if the real problem was the opposite? Before writing, human memory was the only source of knowledge, and everything that wasn't remembered simply disappeared. Imagine an entire civilization existing for thousands of years, developing beliefs, techniques, philosophies, only for everything to be lost because no one survived to tell its story. How many peoples vanished without a trace? How many brilliant ideas died along with their creators? Historians estimate that humanity, as a species, has existed for at least 300,000 years. Yet our written history covers only the last 5,000 years. This means that over 98% of humanity's journey has been lost to oblivion. If that sounds unsettling, consider that even recent history suffers the same fate. For centuries, many cultures relied on oral tradition to pass down essential knowledge. But this chain of transmission is fragile. Each generation forgets a little, changes something, reinterprets facts. In the end, the truth dissolves. Yuval Noah Harari highlights this issue in *Sapiens*. The human brain was not designed to store large amounts of data. It can remember faces, behavior patterns, but not exact lists, dates, or mathematical formulas. This limitation explains why so many ancient civilizations created myths and legends to preserve important information. It was easier to remember a story filled with metaphors and symbols than a set of cold, rational data. But the problem with oral tradition wasn't just forgetfulness, it was also manipulation. Those who told the stories had power over collective memory. If someone altered a detail here and there over time, the original truth could completely disappear. And this problem still exists today. If history has always been shaped by those who controlled the records, how can we be sure that the past we know is real? What has been invented, distorted, or omitted? Without writing, knowledge disappears. But with writing, it can be manipulated. So how can we trust our own collective memory? After all, we are made of what we remember, but also of what we forget. If human memory is flawed and oral tradition was not enough to preserve knowledge, what was the solution? The answer came out of necessity. Around 5,000 years ago, the first great civilizations began to face a new problem: how to manage complex cities, expanding trade, and organize political systems without a reliable method of recording information. That's how writing was born. Around 3,400 BCE, the Sumerians began carving symbols into clay tablets, initially to record commercial transactions, grain, livestock, taxes. But they soon realized this technique could be used for much more than simple bookkeeping. This was the beginning of written language as a system of thought, and this was when one of the greatest leaps in human history occurred. Marshall McLuhan, a communication theorist, once said, "The medium is the message." Writing was not just a method of recording information, it was a new way of thinking. Before writing, knowledge existed only in the present moment, inside people's minds. Now, it could be stored outside the brain, accessed at any time, and passed down to future generations without distortion. From that moment on, the human mind was no longer limited by time and space. Writing became an extension of memory, allowing ideas to survive even after their creators had passed away. But was this a breakthrough or a curse? As we've seen before, Plato had his doubts. He feared that writing would make people intellectually lazy, since instead of developing their own wisdom, they would simply rely on texts that had already been written. In other words, did writing set us free or make us dependent? The invention of writing not only preserved knowledge but also restructured it in a new way. In oral tradition, thought was fluid, adaptable, always reinterpreted by those who told the stories. With writing, it became fixed, absolute, dogmatic. What was written down became an unquestionable truth. Think about the impact this had on religions, for example. Before writing, myths and beliefs were passed down verbally and could change depending on culture and time. But when sacred texts began to be written, their interpretation started to be seen as unchangeable. This had profound consequences for society. Laws, contracts, historical records, everything became based on what was written rather than what could be discussed or reinterpreted. And so, writing shaped not only history, but also the very way we perceive reality. Without writing, there would be no science, philosophy, mathematics, or technology. There would be no Aristotle, Confucius, Newton, or Einstein. But at the same time, without writing, perhaps we would have developed a completely different way of thinking, less rigid and more intuitive. Today we are facing a new revolution, the digital age. Just as writing changed the human brain thousands of years ago, the internet and social media are transforming the way we think once again. But are we truly expanding our knowledge, or are we just creating new information bubbles where we only believe what we want to read? If in the past the problem was forgetting, today it might be information overload. If we once lacked records, now we have so many that it's hard to know what truly matters. Are we writing the future, or just getting lost in it? For millennia, humanity's problem was the scarcity of information. Knowledge was fragile, easily lost to fires, wars, and conquests. Today we face the opposite extreme, the hyperinflation of information. In the past, ignorance stemmed from a lack of records. Today, it comes from excess. We are drowning in data, bombarded by conflicting narratives, manipulated by algorithms that filter what we see and think. Philosopher Jean Baudrillard introduced the concept of the simulacrum, the idea that we live in a reality where representations have replaced facts. According to him, we have reached a point where truth is not only lost, it has become irrelevant. This perfectly fits the digital age. We've never had so much access to history, but do we truly understand the past? Or are we merely consuming distorted versions rewritten to serve modern interests? Yuval Noah Harari warns us, in the past, power belonged to those who had information. Today, power belongs to those who know what to ignore. The information bubbles we create on the internet reflect this. In a world where everyone can choose which reality they want to live in, history is no longer a pursuit of truth. It becomes a tool to validate pre-existing beliefs. What is more dangerous, not knowing something or believing something false? If we once feared books being burned, today books are everywhere, but buried beneath an avalanche of fake news, conspiracy theories, and ideological narratives. Foucault teaches us that knowledge is never neutral. It always comes with a power dynamic. And in the digital era, the new gatekeepers of information are no longer kings or priests. They are corporations, social networks, and artificial intelligence. The question that arises is, are we living a new form of forgetting? Not through the destruction of documents, but through overwhelming noise. Not through silence, but through informational chaos. Knowledge has never been more accessible, yet, paradoxically, it has never been harder to know whom to trust. If history has always been written by the victors, now it can be written by anyone. But does that make us freer, or just more lost? If history has always been written by the victors, if human memory is flawed, and if information can be manipulated, what can we do to protect the truth? The answer may lie in philosophy itself. Hannah Arendt, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, warned about the dangers of reality erosion. To her, the greatest threat to knowledge is not simply the destruction of records, but the weakening of people's ability to distinguish between fact and fiction. The ideal of a totalitarian government is not just to convince people to believe lies, but to make them stop caring about the truth. And that is precisely the challenge we face today. If in the past, the problem was forgetting, today it may be indifference. We live in an age where anyone can access billions of books and historical documents in seconds. But how many people truly seek the truth? How many are willing to question their own beliefs to confront facts even when they are uncomfortable? Truth has never been so accessible and never so fragile. History has already shown us that a single event can erase centuries of knowledge, but it also teaches us that truth endures through those who refuse to forget it. So perhaps the issue is not just about protecting records or fighting disinformation. Maybe it's about something even deeper, protecting our own ability to think critically. If we want to prevent history from repeating itself, or worse, from being erased, we must cultivate curiosity, questioning, and philosophical thinking. We need to learn to recognize when we are being manipulated, when a narrative is being shaped to serve specific interests. And above all, we must understand that truth is not something we simply find. It is something we build, question, and protect every single day. So I leave you with a question to reflect on. What do you consider to be true, and why? The history of humanity is a vast puzzle, but most of the pieces are missing. What we know today is merely a glimpse of what once existed, and perhaps of what could have been. If we've made it this far, it's because someone refused to forget. People who preserved manuscripts, who challenged imposed narratives, who fought to keep knowledge from being erased. And now, that responsibility is ours too. We live in an era where we have access to more knowledge than any generation before us. But this access only matters if we know how to use it, if we have the discipline to look beyond the headlines, to question the stories we're told, and to challenge even our own certainties. If this video made you reflect on how the past influences the present and how the present shapes the future, then don't let this discussion end here. Comment below, what do you think was the greatest loss of knowledge in history? If you could recover a lost piece of the past, what would you choose? Subscribe to the channel for more reflections on philosophy, history, and what it means to be human. And since you've made it this far, there's another video on the screen right now that will make you even more intrigued about how history is shaped and manipulated. Click and watch before it gets lost in time.